Renegade is a hard game for me to review. It was a game I spent a lot of time on as a kid. I remember being in second grade going to school and ranting to my friend Kyle about just how awesome this game was to me. I'd spend hours playing the multiplayer practice against bots, blowing up their base, and I had it all down to a science. I honestly don't remember if I ever actually played the online as a kid. However, I did remember playing the campaign. Or at least I thought I did. It turns out I never really made it that far into the game, actually only the third level, so I figured it was finally time I finished that quest that I started all those years ago. That's what this review is really about. I'm only going to be covering the single player campaign side of things, so if you were looking for a review of the multiplayer or a look back at it, this isn't going to be that video. But to my surprise, even after all these years later, there's still a small, active community out there for it. Also, from looking at other feedback on the game, it seems that my thoughts are pretty aligned with the average community perspective, being that while the multiplayer is great, the single player isn't all that. So with that out of the way, let's get started. Renegade is the black sheep of the Command & Conquer games, abandoning the real-time strategy gameplay the series is known for something a little more action-packed, a first-person shooter. In Renegade, you play as Havoc, who might be the most generic army guy badass I've ever seen. I mean, some of his lines left me just sighing and laughing from how over the top they were.
As long as there isn't any conflict of interest.
Conflict of interest? No. I got interest in conflict.
I don't know, that might honestly be the best single line of dialogue in any video game ever.
I like being a caveman.
The game wastes no time giving you any sort of backstory as to why the GDI and Nod are at war. Instead, it assumes you've already played through the other CNC games. That being said, as someone who has not played the whole way through any other CNC game, it does do a good enough job at telling a mostly self-contained story. It's easy enough to follow once the main story of the game picks up, but the first couple of missions feel random and like you've just been thrown into the middle of a war that you know nothing about. After the second mission, the main plot of the game is revealed. Nod elite forces known as the Black Hand have captured 3 GDI top Tiberium researchers. They are being forced to aid in something called Project Regenesis, which involves creating genetically modified super soldiers. You're tasked with saving the 3 scientists and bringing an end to Project Regenesis. And that's the entire plot, really. It's a simple premise that manages to explain to you what these things are in-game without dumping a hell of a lot of exposition on you. Personally, I'm fine with the storyline being simple for the most part. It helps the game be accessible to people like myself who haven't played the other games, but will satisfy those who have by referencing moments from the war in other games that you now get to play from a different perspective. Man, I started out really loving it again. Feeling the nostalgia from being a kid playing this game. The gunplay still felt really good, even by today's standards. But it wouldn't be long before that feeling started to fade. Those rose-tinted glasses turned to a muddy brown as the repetition started to set in. And while I was having fun in a lot of sections, there were a lot of really dull moments that just dragged. And by the end, I was just kind of waiting for it to finally be over. For how simple the story premise is, you wouldn't think that they'd manage to stretch it out as long as they did. It seemed like every time you were close to achieving your goals, something would happen preventing you from doing so, and set you back to square one. I mean, you spend 3 entire missions working towards rescuing Sydney, one of the people that were originally captured, and after all that work finally getting her back, at the very beginning of the next mission she's recaptured. And the repetition doesn't just stop at the story. A lot of missions will require you to take down structures and enemy bases, and the way you go about these is always the same. You go in, kill everything in your way, place C4 on the control panel and blow it up. These buildings only have a few different layouts, depending on their function, but with how often you have to take these buildings down, it gets tedious. There's only so many times that running down the same path, killing the same enemies, and blowing up the same control panels can be fun. This makes the more open levels feel like a chore, as you know that's exactly what you'll be doing for most of it. Plus, the open levels often feel incredibly slow to progress through, as vehicles are fairly weak in the game. It won't take long before that vehicle you were given to make the trek feel less painful is blown up and you'll be walking it. Don't get me wrong, the scale of some of the levels are downright impressive, especially with the amount of detail that went into them, but it makes for a slog in the gameplay. I like the more confined levels that take you through unique locations that feel different. However, these came with their own issues, mostly due to some design choices. You see, this game is a victim of its time. A time where the best way of prolonging gameplay and making people feel like they got their money's worth was by dramatically spiking the difficulty and bullshit in the later half of the game. What were fairly easy to kill normal soldiers now become battalions of rocket-carrying elite soldiers, and when you're trapped indoors with them, it becomes an absolute nightmare to progress. You'll be making use of quick saves after killing just a few enemies because death can come out of nowhere. They start placing traps with flamethrower and acid thrower enemies right behind doorways and around corners, making it impossible to avoid damage at times. Plus, security turrets start appearing in nearly every corner, and this becomes a real issue when you have escort missions later in the game. No one likes escort missions already, but when you have constant bullshit around every corner and the AI you're escorting moves faster than you, it just becomes frustrating. What's the point in escorting if they're just going to stay ahead of me the entire time? Shouldn't they be behind me and let me clear the enemies before moving forward? Another aspect in which it shows its age is something that a lot of 2000 shooters were guilty of, and that was using the same level you've already played through, but in reverse. The game actually does this twice under the guise that now that you've freed the scientists, you need to escort them back out to safety. From a logical standpoint, sure, that makes sense, but from a gameplay perspective, that doesn't make for a fun mission. Especially during the village section of the game, which just takes entirely too long. It's a big map with rocket launcher enemies hiding out in windows and on top of rooftops, just waiting to blow up the only thing preserving my sanity. However, when the game isn't being an annoying prick, it's actually a lot of fun. The gunplay can be a little awkward, as aiming in the game is all jacked up and some hit detection is off, but I choose to believe that's because I'm playing it in 1920 by 1080, which wasn't accounted for in 2002. The guns themselves are really well designed, and even some of the most basic weapon types feel unique and fun to use. If you pretend the grenade launcher doesn't exist, the weapon lineup is perfect. But I won't even hold that against them, as almost no grenade launcher in any game was actually useful back in the day. The first gun you get is an interesting take on the assault rifle with a 100 round box mag that does pretty good damage and will likely be your go-to until you get the chain gun, which weirdly also has a 100 round mag, but it deals quite a bit more damage. Over time, the chain gun will replace your assault rifle altogether, as the regular soldiers are phased out for black hand soldiers that carry these. You also start with a pistol that has its uses, mostly as a last resort since it has unlimited ammo, but it also kills in a single headshot on regular soldiers. There are so many types of guns in the game though. First of all, I want to give credit. Flamethrowers sort of share the same reputation that grenade launchers have, with them usually being ineffective and often a detriment to yourself. However, the flamethrower here is actually a great crowd control weapon and can stun lock enemies so they can't hurt you while you're killing them. This makes it far more useful than most FPS games' flamethrowers. The rocket launcher is an obvious standout weapon here. You can't have a good FPS without them, and in this game you'll find yourself fighting vehicles while on foot quite often, making them a complete necessity. Both laser weapons are insanely powerful, and towards the end of the game most of the enemies will now be using these, so you'll be finding ammo for them a lot. The lightning gun is overpowered and a lot of fun, but unfortunately you don't get one until the final level. The Tiberium guns are automatic weapons that deal quite good damage, and also inflict damage over time, but come at a risk. When you kill someone with these weapons, they have a chance of turning into a weird Tiberium blob that will attack you as well, and they can take a lot of damage to kill. Then finally you have the personal ion cannon, which is just this game's version of a railgun. The only auto mission is a shotgun, which is usually standard for FPS games. It stands out even weirder when you consider the fact that the multiplayer has a shotgun, so it missing from the campaign just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. I can't forget to give credit for the graphics though. I mean, just look at this game. This looks really good for a game from 2002. In fact, I'd go as far as to say it was ahead of its time in that regard. The outdoor environments are especially impressive, with massive maps that often have multiple approaches to many of the combat sections. The fact that they managed to make massive sprawling levels that looked as good in 2002 is baffling. Plus, personally, I'm already a sucker for snowy maps in games, but this one is just built different. Even the indoor levels are nice to look at, and they have a lot of verticality, which makes them even more impressive. The only aspect that could have used some work is the inside of the generic buildings, considering how often you have to go through them. While the outsides of the buildings manage to be faithful recreations of the structures in the older Command & Conquer games, the insides are very plain and copy-paste with mostly solid gray walls. The AI has always been something that people have criticized for being dumb, but I see it as more inconsistent. Sometimes they're completely oblivious to you despite you being right next to them, while other times they're already shooting at you before you even turn the corner. This is especially true for the rocket soldiers, making them an absolute massive pain like I said earlier. However, there's a nice variety of enemy types, which is surprising considering it's mostly just soldier versus soldier combat. But each type of soldier tends to act a bit differently, which I like. Your standard nod soldier will sort of just stand in place and shoot you, but doesn't try to push too hard, while the officers and blackhand soldiers will pursue you as soon as they spot you. The rocket soldiers can be a bit of a mixed bag, but it really just depends on their placement. Most of the time they're placed like a sniper, with them launching rockets from inside windows or on top of buildings, but man, when they're inside, they're a completely different animal. They have no self-preservation person and would rather put an end to both you and themselves than turn away from a fight. The Tiberium-infused super soldiers are interesting, but really only pose a threat when they have the Tiberium rifle in hand, just because they manage to shoot fast and are insanely accurate. Honestly though, most of the enemies are fun to fight as long as they're placed right. Most of my deaths throughout my normal playthrough were due to sneaky rocket soldier placement and corner sentries that blend in with the grey walls. Circling back to the beginning, I said this review was hard for me to make. I think it's just because I wish it was as exciting as it was when I was a kid. I've been waiting to come back to this game for years, and I'm just kinda saddened by the fact that it didn't live up to my own hype. Rather than the main character feeling generic and cliche, I saw him as a badass. Rather than being annoyed by repetitious design choices, I liked that I knew how to win easily and could keep doing it. When you're a kid, you look past repetition easily because the core gameplay is fun and that's all you really care about. It's the same reason why we used to watch the same movies over and over again. For some people that still works, you can enjoy it for what it really is, but for me, growing up I lost the ability to enjoy repetition. A game I loved as a kid wound up feeling mediocre to me as an adult. It almost makes me wish I just hadn't replayed it, as I'd rather remember it as the game I loved so many years ago. In the end, I don't think the campaign holds up that well in 2021. While the graphics are still pretty damn good, most of the campaign just doesn't feel as good. If you are gonna play it, just play the multiplayer. There are still communities out there that you can find pretty easily, and using W3D Hub, you can see when servers are still active. I'll leave a link in the description if you feel like checking that out.